Fractal Design has had a busy year for case launches. They've had the Define C, the Define Mini C case, and they also had the Meshify C. All three of these enclosures fall into the category of not garbage, which is pretty rare for cases in the last year. So today, they're launching the Define R6, which we are reviewing, and hopefully it also falls into the not garbage category of cases. Before getting to those, this coverage is brought to you by EVGA and their 1080 Ti SC2, which we've recommended fairly highly for its build quality and the ICX sensors, which are kind of fun to play with. You can check our full SC2 review for the 1080 Ti if you're curious to learn more, or you can click the link in the description below to find the product page for the 1080 Ti SC2. So this is the Define R6, following up the Define R5, which was a really popular case. And just, again, the Meshify C came out not too long ago. We actually liked that case a good bit. The Define C had a high build quality, good cable management features, all that stuff. It's a little on the warm side and not a lot of room to improve compared to the Meshify C, but there's two options there that were both pretty good build quality. Also a rarity lately. This is the R6. This one comes in a bit more expensive at $150, so it's quite a bit more than, it's about 2 times the Meshify C, and it's got a couple of more flagship type features to it. So to walk you through the basics, the Define R6 has all of the marketing checkbox elements except for RGB LEDs. We'll all mourn the loss, I guess. But other than that, it does have tempered glass. It does have vertical GPU support, which we've been pretty, you know how we feel about that, I think, over the last few months. Power supply shroud, all that stuff, semi-modular design. Couple cool new features though. The side panel actually mounts in a way that is not old or idiotic in its mounting. There's been a lot of that this year as well, so it just pops out like that. Like it just pulls. And there's a release and that's all there is to it. And you clip it back in. So I actually really like that. It's a small feature, but at this point, it's the small stuff that counts with cases, especially when they're $150. So job well done, Fractal, for making a side panel that actually has a good removal mechanism, something that like feels like it makes sense when you're using it. They have a button in the back that is kind of reminiscent of what NZXT just did. Now, they're not copying each other. These cases take a while to develop. NZXT probably launched theirs. I'm sure Fractal was like, we've been working on that same thing for like the last 6 months. So they're not copying each other, I don't think. But they do have a button on the back like NZXT. NZXT's pops off the left side panel. Fractal's button pops up the top side, the top panel. Now, you'll notice when I pushed it, you probably didn't really see anything happen on camera. That's because to actually remove it, you still have to get up in there from inside the case. So it's a nice idea, but it doesn't have the same tactile feel that NZXT's does, where you can push it and it almost shoots off the side like a rocket. So yeah, not the best implementation, really not that much different than just not having the button and pushing it up with some clips. So that could use work, but it was a cool idea, and we're happy to see Fractal at least trying stuff that's mechanical and different and not poorly executed to a point of being hugely detrimental. I mean, if that's your main complaint about the case, that you push a button and there's no spring tension release or anything like that, if that's the main complaint, you're in pretty good shape. So not a big deal, but definitely something they can improve on. Other core features of the case, other than the mechanical stuff, I guess there's a bit more mechanical. You can pull out this shroud on the front half of the case. It's basically a hard drive shroud. You can pull that out. You can pull all the drive cages out, and you can just leave it basically open air, similar to something like, well, most of the cases right now, really, where they have their drives hidden in the bottom front under the shroud, and then the rest is all open. You could do more liquid cooling that way, bigger radiator support in terms of thickness, all that kind of stuff. We did test it for airflow with all the cages removed versus stock, which is how I have it set up right now, and you'll see those thermal numbers in a bit. But other than that, they've done a good job with the EPS 12-volt hole placement. That's something that some cases have overlooked this year as well. So they have them in 2 key locations, which will cover pretty much every board. They've also got sort of standard rubber grommets, things like that, stuff that's not too important or innovative overall. But the big thing here is something you can't really see as much as you can feel, which is the build quality is actually good. The panel thickness it comes together in a way that there's some rigidity to the case. It doesn't feel like it's flimsy and falling apart. And the construction quality is good. The airflow paths are okay. As you'll see in the thermals, they're just kind of okay, which for a case that's marketed as more silence focused and acoustics focused is actually good. I mean, if you kind of weight the scale and your focus is on either airflow or noise, you can't do both, then if you're doing okay, average in the one that you're not focusing on, that's really about where you want to be. You can't really be good at both noise suppression and high airflow. Doesn't really work that way, generally speaking. So they're kind of okay with airflow. The reason they're in a decent spot with airflow relative to their marketing, which is noise focused, is because there's about maybe an inch, 3/4 of an inch side intake on the front, and it is on both sides, unlike other cases this year. Not sure why that's so hard. And they have 2 fans pre-installed in the front. They also have 1 fan pre-installed in the back. There's not much point in buying extra fans here. It comes with pretty much every slot populated that you could populate, short of going closed loop route and just putting better fans on it for the sake of better fans. So they actually do populate all the slots. It does matter. It does help. And the ventilation is good enough that in a noise-focused case, you'll be fine. But, I mean, again, not going to lead any charge because ultimately that front is still solid. There's no mesh there. It's not going to lead in thermals while having that front on it. But that's not the goal. And the reason I bring this up is because you look at something like the H500P, where we have marketing materials from Cooler Master saying guaranteed high air volume case, or you look at something like the BitPhoenix Enso, which had marketing material that talked about these hidden ventilation ports on the front panel, which is like hidden in the sense of an invisibility cloak. You can't see them because they don't exist. Those marketing materials are objectively misleading or false, so we knock them for that. In Fractal's case, they're not really marketing high airflow, at least in the review guide and the materials we received. They're marketing noise suppression. So that's what we're going to be looking at most. Now, to that end, you pop off the other panels, and they've got this sort of, it's the usual foam. It's maybe a millimeter, a half millimeter thick. It's got kind of a canvas finish on it. Theoretically, this will primarily help with things like coil whine, high-pitched noises, stuff where you've got a really short wave, small waveform that just hits all the divots in the side and breaks apart. And so hopefully that kind of stops most of the higher-pitched, higher-frequency noises from reaching you, or it mitigates them. The only way to stop lower-frequency noises is thick paneling, something like 5mm aluminum, stuff like that, which is unreasonable for most cases. So yeah, they're targeting a suppression of the annoying whine noises, which is kind of what you want to do, and let the metal handle the rest, the low whirs and things like that. So yeah, let's get into the testing. We have a full written review of this, as always. That is written by Patrick Lathan, who worked on the case primarily. He has a couple of other opinions that are worth reading, linked in the article below. I'm going to focus on the thermals and the noise for you, and we'll get to the conclusion. So as always, our testing methodology will be detailed in the article linked in the description below. We are primarily referencing temperature as delta T over ambient, so it is DT over ambient, meaning we're removing ambient from the measurement. And for extra tests, we removed the front panel, not just the door, but the entire front panel, which is something we're doing standard now. We mounted the GPU vertically, we opened the top modu vent, as Fractal calls it, and we reconfigured to the open layout, removing the hard drive cages and the shroud in the front. As usual, we're starting with only the temperatures for the Define R6 and its different configurations. Then we'll look at comparative data with other cases. Average CPU temperature during the torture test was 56 degrees Celsius, but dropped to 45.4 degrees with the whole front panel removed. This is a newly standardized test for us and helps determine how much headroom a case has to thermally improve its design. We'll have to look at the resulting noise levels later, though, to see what kind of acoustic impact there is by removing the front panel, because it's obviously not a realistic scenario. This temperature drop is to be expected with all the noise damping and baffles in the way of the airflow. Opening the top had a much less dramatic but still significant impact on lowered CPU temperatures, which is an effect we've seen before. Vertical GPU mounting gets the radiative heat from the backplate away from the CPU cooler, further aiding in lowering CPU temperatures, but we'll have to see what it does for the GPU in a moment. As for Fractal's open layout, wherein the drive cages are removed and the side shroud is relocated, the layout had no real effect on CPU temperatures. So for our configuration with air cooling, we're just not really seeing a change. You might as well leave them in there. There are certain situations where you'd want to remove them though, primarily with custom water loops and things of that nature. Fractal's Define R6 next appears in our Comparative Cpu Benchmarks. 56 degrees is around where the NZXT S340 Elite, Cooler Master H500P, and stock Define C scored. Middle of the chart temperatures that aren't really impressive by themselves, but are made impressive primarily and only by the R6's emphasis on silence. This becomes a question of marketing. When the product, like the BitPhoenix Enso or the H500P, claims to offer high airflow and low temperatures, it needs to actually do so. The Define R6, in the marketing materials we received, never claimed outright top performance in thermals. It's a silence-focused case, and so we'll look at those in a moment. If the case can deliver lower than average noise levels while maintaining average to slightly below average temperatures, it'll be in an okay position, and then it's up to the user to make a decision whether that makes sense for their build or not. The stock Meshify C and then Be Quiet's more expensive Darkbase 700 were slightly cooler than this, but the competing Darkbase Pro 900 and PureBase 600 in terms of thermal and acoustic performance were both warmer. Opening the top cover though pushed the R6 up quite a few spots, better than anything the Define C achieved with the front panel on and stock fans, and slightly better than the Corsair 270R. Removing the front panel expectedly demonstrates that the R6 could run way cooler with an open face, but we'll see if the enclosure makes up for this in acoustic performance. That is, again, ultimately the marketing objective. Average GPU temperature was 56.4 degrees in the stock torture test, which only dropped about 3 degrees when the front panel was removed. Not much room for improvement when looking at just the Define R6's numbers here. Neither opening the top cover nor the open layout had a significant impact on GPU temperature. This makes sense as neither is particularly beneficial to the airflow bath for the GPU specifically anyway. The vertical GPU mount caused a huge temperature increase, as usual, to 72.7 degrees Celsius, delta T over ambient, with a definite decrease in frequency as the GPU diode hit 93 degrees in its actual temperature. We have a frequency over time plot for that. So we are dropping clocks pretty hard here, as the hard throttle wall for NVIDIA Pascal architecture is about 84 degrees Celsius, and at 82 you start dropping clocks, at 60 you start dropping clocks, and so on. So this is actually dropping pretty hard. Since Fractal sent us the proper PCIe riser cable, we didn't have to strap everything together with zip ties, and the GPU and CPU coolers didn't even make contact like they have in some other cases. So this is just how it is with air-cooled components in this configuration. As we've been saying for 6 months now, vertical GPU mounts for open-face cards just don't really make sense. They perform awfully, and you'd ideally use this for an open-loop configuration, as the liquid makes up for any radiative or airflow disadvantages. Since the GPU is much more aggressive about altering clock speed to lower temperature, the differences between cases are smaller on our GPU comparison chart. 56.4 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient is just 0.2 degrees warmer than the Meshify C and Define C with the extra Noctua intake fans, and so we can call these functionally the same. It's still on the warm side for what we consider decent. Both the Be Quiet Darkbase 700 and Darkbase Pro 900 have lower GPU temperatures, and the cheaper PureBase 600 is roughly equivalent. We mention these because they are noise focused. A lot of this comes down to that shroud. Although the enclosure gets decent airflow into it, roughly on par with the case that has two 200mm fans in the front, no less, the shroud is still trapping some of the heat from the open face card, despite that ventilation port in the top of the shroud, and there's just not much that can be done about it aside from focusing more airflow toward the bottom of the chassis. While looping 3D Mark's Firestrike Extreme test, average GPU temperature was 59.5 degrees over ambient, about on par with the BitPhoenix Enso and Corsair Spec 04. This is a little bit embarrassing for a $150 case, the Define R6, as it's scoring alongside one of the worst cases we've reviewed lately. The Darkbase 700 was significantly cooler at 54.6 degrees Celsius, but both the stock Meshify C and Define C were warmer thanks to their limited stock fans. This could be improved, again, by adding fans, as you would expect, and you can see our reviews for each of those to see how we added fans and what they did. Rendering our Blender test on the CPU, average CPU delta T over ambient was 36.9 degrees. That's cooler than any case we've run that test on except for the Silverstone RL06, including the Darkbase Pro 900 and Darkbase 700. The R6 is definitely capable of keeping an air-cooled CPU at safe temperatures under this kind of load. However, rendering on the GPU, average GPU delta T over ambient was 29.2 degrees. Relative to other cases, it fared better than it did in Firestrike, but still not enough to compete with the 2B quiet cases. The R6 did cool better than the Meshify C and Define C, and it beat the ENSO by 3 degrees. This teaches us something important. The R6 primarily starts struggling with GPU and CPU thermals when both are under load. It doesn't have enough pathways for hot air to escape the enclosure, which is something that we don't always see pop up as an issue because some of these cases are more capable of exhausting the heat than others. An open-face card will always require some form of escape for all that air that's being shot into the case. In the stock configuration for noise levels, with the fans at max speed, the R6 reached 33.8 dBA. All the baffles and padding, as you can see here, really do something. They actually work, and Fractal's marketing delivers. With the top cover opened, noise levels increased measurably, but not necessarily audibly, to 34.9 dBA, and with the front panel removed completely, it jumped to 39.7 dBA. 33.8 decibels is almost exactly the same as the PureBase 600, and the only case that's quieter at max RPM is the Thermaltake Core P3 because it has no fans. So the case in terms of build quality is actually very good. It's well done. It has a good structural feel to it. You can't really flex it like you can with a lot of cases. And although you're not going to sit there and try and flex your case or bow it or anything like that, the point is that it's actually built with quality materials and it doesn't feel like cheap crap that you're going to throw away in a year. So they've done well there. And this is something Fractal's done well with the Define C and to some extent the Meshify C as well. So that hasn't changed. We still would praise Fractal for their build quality and tooling of this case. The noise levels are also pretty good. They've done well with isolating noise that can be annoying with these foam pads. They actually do work, as we've seen. Now, one thing we don't show is frequency spectrum analysis. That would show you, if we had the configuration, the test setup for it, would show you that, yes, lower frequency noises are still going to be heard at about the same level as on pretty much every case, except for 5mm thick aluminum ones. But the higher frequency noises, like coil whine, are dealt with pretty handily by this material on the side panels and the top panel. So Fractal's done well there, and that fits their marketing. Where they fall behind a bit is still thermals. This is acceptable to some extent because they're not saying that they're a high airflow case. They don't guarantee high air volume. They don't say they have hidden vents in the panels. They're saying they're good at noise suppression, and they are. So it's okay to be a bit behind in thermals if you're not marketing them as a leading selling point. Fractal ends up about middle of the chart for some of the thermal tests. They're pretty bad in others. Vertical mounted open face GPU, we absolutely don't recommend. And we also didn't recommend it for the View 71 or any other case that had that option. You could do open loop if you wanted to use it. The CPU and GPU both being under intensive load is pretty hard on the case. It has trouble getting rid of the heat once it collects it because you've really got no good escape for all of that dissipating energy from the GPU down here. So what's it do? It's going to radiate up off the back plate. The fans will disperse it throughout the case. You've got this glass insulation on the side, and the only way really to get it out is eventually to get sucked through the CPU cooler if it's an air cooler, like a tower cooler, and then pushed out the back of the case. That increases your CPU temperatures a bit as well. And the GPU has its own problems with the CPU cooler, tower cooler, radiating heat off of it, hitting the back plate. So it does struggle a bit when both are under heavy load. However, it still functions. It's not really throttling. Only starts dropping clocks hard when you're side mounted with a vertical GPU. Not the worst thing in the world. So yeah, overall, Fractal has a case that is average to slightly below average in thermal performance. However, if you weight it relative to its marketing, which is what we do, it's doing decently for thermals compared to its noise performance, its acoustic performance, and the build quality pretty much makes up for everywhere that Fractal falls short thermally. So they've definitely got some stuff they can improve on. That's what you want in any product, but it's something we could recommend at its price point, which the last like 4 cases we've reviewed, I couldn't say that for. So this is refreshing, and it's nice to have a case that doesn't suck and is actually good build quality. As far as thermals, if you really care about that kind of thing, you could buy better fans. It's $150. You probably have some money anyway, so you could improve it a bit if you had to. Or you pop up the top vent and you increase your noise levels by 1.5 dBA and you decrease the temperature significantly. So those are your options. As always, if you want to read more about this case, click the article linked in the description below for additional opinions and notes from Patrick. You can subscribe for more. We have a couple other cases coming up. And go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one of our new zipper hoodies, or the GN mod mat, which we've been pretty proud of showing off. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.